As a snow sports instructor, how do you deliver a lesson to a group of students with multiple unrelated goals, differing needs, varying skill levels, and other considerations while providing value to each student by helping them work towards their goals? It's a difficult problem that everyone faces, from new instructors working with beginners, to staff trainers training groups of instructors, to even teaching assessment candidates being evaluated on how they coach their peers. In this webinar, I break down my process for performing movement analysis on groups of students. We'll take a look at two actual PSIA Level 2 candidates while walking through the steps of the movement analysis process in a group setting together. While I provide my observations, evaluations, and prescriptions for each of these students, I'd encourage you to grab a notepad and follow along with your own thoughts as we go through each step. I'd love to hear what you come up with in the comments. Please enjoy this episode of Okemo Tech Talks, brought to you by the Okemo Ski Ride School. So ultimately, the question we're here to answer tonight, right, is how can we deliver a group lesson that caters to a diverse group of students with various goals, with various needs, and with various skill levels? I want to start by getting at the root of this issue we're trying to tackle tonight, okay? And there's this cool concept being developed by the national team called the relevance gap. And in short, it's a cool way of thinking about how our behavior as instructors and the decisions we make shape the lesson experience over time, right? So the idea is that we have this blue squiggly line here, which basically represents how our students come into a lesson with a particular set of desired outcomes and needs. But those needs are ever changing throughout a lesson, right? Like changing needs, like I guess students nailing a task or a focus. And we need to make changes to help keep pushing them forward, right? Make it a little bit harder, challenge them more. Or maybe they're struggling with what we gave them and we need to back it off a bit and make it a little bit more approachable, right? Maybe they're building confidence throughout the lesson as we help them improve and they're up to higher challenges, but then maybe something throws them off and fear throws all of that confidence away, right? And we have to adjust appropriately. So at each one of these points, our job as an instructor is to constantly observe, reevaluate, and make changes to our lesson plan to adapt to these changing needs. And so we have this pink line here, right? And that represents our behavior as instructors with the circles representing decision points, right? Ideally, as the needs of the student change, the instructor is taking note of these changes or of these changing needs and they're making changes to their own behavior and the lesson plan to adapt, right? And the general idea behind this relevance gap is to minimize this gap here shaded in yellow, right? And this is what we call the relevance gap. And this signifies how close our behavior matches our students' needs. What's less ideal is when an instructor comes into a lesson, evaluates once or not at all, and maybe picks a lesson plan that they get stuck on come hell or high water, right? And that's not to say this always produces a bad lesson that leads to no improvement, but in this instance, that gap, a much larger relevance gap here shaded in red, doesn't provide any opportunity to make adjustments for the students. So for my future assessment candidates that are on the call tonight, this is the canned presentation teaching segment, right? The teaching segment where a candidate comes into an assessment, they have a few progressions prepared for different skills, and they pick one maybe based on what they see, but are more concerned about what they're presenting instead of what the students in front of them are doing. But this whole graph, right, that we're looking at right now is kind of with a single student in mind. So what if we add another student to this equation, right? And then another student, another, and another, right? Things start to get a little bit more messy, right? And this is kind of the crux of group lessons, okay? Not only do we have one student coming in with a particular set of goals and needs, now we have multiple, right? They might have different goals. They might strive for different styles of skiing. They might have different levels of risk tolerance, fitness, cognitive abilities, or whatever. And We'll dive into this a little bit more momentarily, but this is the core of the biggest difficulty with any kind of group lesson, instructor clinic, or teaching assessment. So how do we address this from a movement analysis perspective, right? In snow sports instruction, right, movement analysis is just a process that defines how we tend to make observations of students to determine their current ski and body performance. It defines how we tend to evaluate those observations and determine what needs to change to help them work towards their goals. And it also defines how we make prescriptions to the body movements and give them activities to help with that to create changes in ski performance. And so typically we define the movement analysis process as consisting of these 3 steps, right? Observe, evaluate, and prescribe. And we're going to walk through all of these in a moment, but for the sake of tonight's discussion, I want to add a step to this process. It's a step that I don't want to say it isn't included or it isn't discussed, but it's kind of more of an implicit part of the process. And I want to make this step a little bit more explicit, right? And so that step I want to add is consider, okay? Consider the student's desired goals and outcomes before anything else and value that above all else. And besides the fact that that should be the foundation of any lesson, right? The reason why I want to be so explicit about it is because it serves as my foundation for every other step in the movement analysis process, especially when dealing with groups. And so in a perfect world, right, we have a group of students with similar skill levels and similar goals, but how often does that happen, right? Many times we don't. And so when I start with this first step as my foundation, it allows me to take all of the noise of having multiple students with multiple goals, with varying needs, varying skill levels, and begin to tune into the most important elements. Right? It allows me to narrow my focus on which movements I'm observing. It helps dictate my evaluation of those students. And then finally, it helps direct the prescription to help move them closer to the desired goals we started this process by considering. So let's start with this new first step here. Considering the student's goals and desired outcomes. Right? So not everyone comes to a lesson for the same reason or the reasons that we assume. When we all show up to a mountain, right, we often have this personal idea of what makes good skiing that we try to emulate. And that tends to also shape what we look for and want to improve in others. But students come to lessons or clinics for a variety of reasons, right? It might just be for general ski improvement, like, hey, I don't have any particular goals, just looking to get better, right? Or they might have a very particular set of goals in mind, like, I want to get better at moguls. Maybe they might love skiing, but hate how tired they get. Can we get their legs to burn a little less so they can ski longer, right? And there's a multitude of other reasons. The list goes on. Another factor is, like, we all have different styles of skiing that we strive for, right? Think about some of the major disciplines in skiing, like racing, freestyle, moguls, or big mountain. Every one of those groups of skiers has a completely kind of different look to them, right? Maybe they're after different feelings or experiences when they're out in snow. But like, just because I love doing 60 miles an hour and feeling the G-forces of carving turns, right, doesn't mean that's what my students want to do. Like, that'd be a pretty hard sell to my mom. But the cool thing is about assessments, though, is if you're an assessment goer, it narrows the field a bit, right? If you get asked to do something like make the group better at this activity, that narrows down the goal focus quite a bit. But with that said, you have an entire day of riding chairlift with these folks, right? Spending some time to get to know them a little bit better and understand their goals outside of the assessment environment isn't exactly going to hurt your teaching and people skills, especially if you can implement them into a teaching segment without detracting from the primary goals set out by the assessment environment. So on top of differing goals among students, we have differing needs, right? Different people tend to have different levels of risk tolerance, for example, right? Some folks are just predispositioned to taking risk, while others can have their entire performance and learning environment ruined because of fear. right? Even different situations can trigger people in different ways. I'm super comfortable skiing fast and on the edge of disaster on groomers, or even like catching air in moguls, but kind of hilariously, if you take me to a terrain park, I am a massive wimp, right? I am terrified of terrain parks. Like, I've had 9-year-old students send it off jumps I'm petrified of. And so there's many other needs to consider, right? People have different cognitive, emotional, social, and physical needs. And I'm not, I'm not likely going to have the same lesson outcome in mind for a 20-year-old athlete with a racing background that I'm going to have for something like an 80-year-old just trying to enjoy the sport as much as they used to, right? People might have different preferences on learning styles. But otherwise, often people come into lessons with varying levels of competence in different skiing skills, right? But the most interesting piece of this, as far as this varying skill level component is that there's kind of a bell curve, right, on how hard we push our students and promote their motor skill improvement when it comes to skiing skills, right? If we have students skiing at something like 50 or 80% of their ability, they might get better, but probably not much, because we're not doing anything novel or new with them, right? We're not pushing them past what they do every day. And likewise, if we push people way too hard to where they're struggling just to stay upright and they're focusing on survival, they're not going to spend enough time actually getting it right to make a habit of the proper movement patterns. But there's this like golden zone in the middle. And I put 103% on the slide here. I can't remember the exact number. There was a study behind this. But the main idea is that if we challenge our students to be in this zone that's just a smidge beyond their current skill level, right? A place where they're not always successful, but enough where they can focus on the task at hand and get better over time, right? That's where the peak of that bell curve is, and where the most learning is likely to occur, right? The thing is, keeping a single student in that zone, it can be pretty straightforward. But what if we have a group that's all over the place in terms of skill level? And we'll get to more on this in a moment here, when we get to the prescription step of this process. But this is what we need to start thinking about during our consider step, right? Considering the goals, considering the needs of our students. So at the core of taking on all of these challenges with diverse goals and diverse needs, though, is it's simply create a dialogue, right? Especially like as newer instructors, sometimes we get too worried about what we're going to do and what we're going to say. Like, haha, what am I going to do? I've got 6 hours with my students, right? That we forget about the students in front of us sometimes. If I'm teaching a lesson, the first step for me isn't to get into the thick of teaching. It's what made you want to take a lesson today, right? Or even when an instructor comes to a clinic, right? I've stopped coming with literally any semblance of a plan on how I'm going to run things that day, right? Our day starts with a couple of warm-up runs and some chairlift discussions on what brought each individual out to that clinic today. People, especially the general public, don't care about how much you know, right? The most requested instructors at any ski resort are often not the gold pen nerds who are amazing skiers, right? Oftentimes, they're the level ones or the level nothings who have amazing people skills and are great at forming relationships with the people in front of them. So let's take a look at our 2 level 2 candidates that we'll be taking a look at tonight. And I don't have a lot of bullet points here. I don't want to overcomplicate this process so we can keep tonight rolling along. But anytime I practice movement analysis on my own, and places like YouTube are a wonderful resource for things like this, I try to keep a couple things in mind, right? I try to establish an intent. And by intent, I don't mean what I would have done or what I think they should have done. I mean, what were they trying to do here, right? sometimes that information isn't available, but I've put together a couple student profiles for here tonight. So we've got Audrey on the left here, right? And she's got level 2 ambitions and has been really working on her medium radius turns, okay? She's originally from a small mountain, and so she comes from a background of having a bit of a smaller comfort zone when it comes to speed and aggressiveness, but she's been pushing those boundaries quite a bit. And for the record, I swear, I'm not trying to play into gender stereotypes here. I just happen to know these people very well, with Audrey being my wonderful girlfriend who is on the call tonight. And Rich being a great friend of mine and one of my favorite clinic participants that will make me sad when he leaves me for the Black Pod. But so Rich, on the other hand, was actually going for his level 2 as of this video that we'll be watching, and has actually passed the skiing after making some of the changes that I will be kind of briefly mentioning tonight. But in his video, he's performing short radius turns. But to give you some additional background, Rich, while certainly not absent of fear, as he's got a day job he has to show up for like most reasonable humans, tends to be a little bit more aggressive in his skiing. He plays around, I think, a little bit in the race world a bit, and is just more risk tolerant compared to Audrey. So leapers, though, was an assessment task in particular he was having difficulty with, okay? And for those that don't know what a leaper is, it's just simply an assessment activity where the edge change or turn transition happens in the air due to a leap, okay? The skier finishes the turn on one set of edges, they jump, and they land in the new turn on their new edges. It's a simple task and idea, but I'm sure, as many of you know, it's a far more difficult in execution, as a lot of people don't finish their turns in this nice kind of flex position like Michael does here on the left, right? Because you need to be able to flex to be able to extend and generate enough power to jump and leave the ground. But instead, what often happens is they finish their turns with a longer downhill leg. A lot of skiers do. So then they don't have enough room to extend and jump, right? So the big issue Rich was having was barely being able to leave the ground in a leaper, okay? So that might give you a hint of things to begin to look for when we begin to observe him. So we have the start of our 2 student profiles here, okay? Audrey is working on her medium radius turns, as we'll see in the video, and tends to just be a tad more risk averse, okay? And while Rich is going to be doing short turns in his video, right, he has an issue with leapers that needs addressed before he goes for his level 2. But I will say, even though he's doing short turns in the video, the core movement problem that has caused issues for him with leapers is absolutely visible in the video, right? So maybe a hint. So this brings us to the next step of our movement analysis process, observing current ski performance and body movements. So a lot of people ask, where do I start, right? Where do I start? Do I start with the skis? Do I start with the body? Maybe the whole picture? And I'm, of course, not going to directly answer this question. And instead, I'm going to show you something that I actually read recently and found interesting. There's a group of researchers that worked particularly in the realm of baseball athlete development. And 2 of those researchers were named Logan and McKinney, their last names. And they published a lot of papers on the subject. And some of their papers discussed movement and the movement analysis process for assessing the development of these athletes. And I unfortunately cannot find the original study to save my life where they spelled this out, but I actually read about it in a pretty obscure little piece of PSA reading material that was published when I was a ripe 3 years old, called The Ski Instructor's Guide to the Physics and Biomechanics of Skiing. Okay? And as you skim through this list here, I'm not going to read it off on screen, but there might be some elements that are pretty obviously not applicable to skiing, like the baseball swing follow through. But the author of the biomechanics paper gave us a tweaked version for skiing. And I'll let you all read through this, but the interesting takeaway here is that we often hear people repeat the term, like, or the phrase, start with the skis, start with the skis. But that's not what this list starts with, is it? right? And that start with the skis message is one I've probably repeated myself, even though that might not always be what I do every time I practice. Don't tell anyone. But ultimately, the takeaway here is that you should develop a process that works for you, as it may not be the same for everyone, okay? Like, your process might be to start with the skis, and that's fine. That's completely fine. But your process might be to copy this modified version created by a biomechanics expert as a starting point. That would also be okay. I wouldn't say I follow it exactly, but whatever works for you if you need a starting point, right? And your process might be completely different depending on the scenario. But the one truth in that idea of start with the skis is that any observation you make should relate back to what the skis are doing. You all may or may not have seen some videos of a guy who, like, he literally juggles while he skis, like juggles pins while he's skiing trees or crazy terrain out west. I think he's out of Jackson Hole or something like that. And while hand placement can certainly affect ski performance, the juggler is a prime example of how little impact something like that, what the hands are doing, may actually have on ski performance. So if the student is skiing with their hands to their side, but doesn't actually have any connection to with what the skis are actually doing, that feedback isn't very helpful, right? We all have different body proportions and anatomy, and what body performance gets the ski to perform one way for one skier may not be the same for another. So two things that matter with observation, right? Observations should be, to start, non-judgmental. A guy on YouTube, for example, told me that my pole plants suck, right? And that's a judgment-based observation that not only did not communicate to me what sucked about my pole plants, but also made no relation to what my ski was doing and how improving my pole plant might improve what my skis are doing, right? So try to make all observations like kind of almost strictly literal in their description of what the ski and body is doing. Like, what you are describing should be an objective truth that is either true or false, right? Rather than an opinion or a judgment. But ultimately, when we enter observation mode, we should come in with a clear purpose in mind. There's a lot we could observe, but we have limited time and opportunities, right? When we enter a group setting, now you have an even more complex array of observations that could be made. And so the reason we started with my consider step is because we can use what we learned from that to help narrow our focus of what we observe across the students in our group. And we'll discuss this in one moment with our two students we're using as examples here, but the takeaway here is this. Start with their goals to narrow your focus when making observations. So where do we start with categorizing our observations, right? I won't be going into horrendous detail because these could be 5 separate webinars, at least on their own. But in the PSIA, we define 5 fundamentals that are present in all expert skiers, regardless of style or discipline. And I'll be staying out of the weeds tonight as far as terminology because we have a pretty diverse audience, almost 100 people on, it looks like tonight, that may or may not even be associated with the PSIA. But no matter how you categorize these fundamentals or skills, these are often a great starting point, right? How is pressure distributed along the length of the skis, right? Which ski is pressure being directed to and why? How do they get their skis on edge, right? And how much edge do they have and when? How are the skis being steered or rotated? Or like, how is the skier managing pressure from the snow pushing back at them? Right? This is probably how most people make observations, often going with one fundamental or skill at a time and evaluating them. But I want to share some other thoughts to open the possibilities. So I've very much become a biomechanics nerd. I love studying it. And the way I've been categorizing my observations a lot lately is not so much the fundamentals or skills themselves all the time, but knowing the body movements that make up these fundamentals and how they overlap. right? If you look through here, and I'll make a few highlights, there's some commonalities. Movements like flexion and extension of the ankles, knees, and hips are a body movement that has a direct effect on, I would say, 4 of the fundamentals and indirectly on the other. Movements like creating angles in the ankles, knees, hips, and torso can also affect, I would say, at least 2 or 3 of these fundamentals, right? And this is certainly not a comprehensive list, but this is an example of how I can take a group of students and find commonalities beyond just skiing skills or fundamentals, right? I could have a student where one student needs maybe fore and aft pressure work, another needs to work on their lateral pressure or edging, and let's say like another has ski chatter issues and needs to work on regulating their ski or ski snow interaction pressure. Right. And since I know flexion and extension of the leg joints has an effect on all of those skills, I now have a place in their bodies I can focus my observations that caters to all of their differing needs. If you have any interest on a kind of a more approachable discussion on a very complicated subject in biomechanics and physics, I actually already put together a webinar on the subject that I would check it out if you haven't seen it. I'm also working on a direct to YouTube video series on the subject that I would be thrilled if you stay tuned for, as in not a webinar. But I have the outline written for about 4 videos so far, and the script is for the first one is almost finished. So pretty excited about those. But beyond looking at individual fundamentals or skills, right? Beyond body movements, another option that I sometimes use for categorizing my observations is more bigger picture concepts, right? I might have a group of skiers that I start my observations with, like kind of just seeing how they change edges between turns, for example, right? Our last tech talk, and I think he's on here tonight. Yep, Dave Raybould. Thanks to him. He broke down different types of turn transitions in the last tech talk, right? So things you might look for in that zone, like, right? Are they changing edges by extending one or both legs? Are they changing edges by flexing one or both legs? Maybe they're using some combination of flexing one leg while extending the other, right? So, and there's pros and cons to each one of these transition types, for example, and how people change edges. Different types of turn transitions are, and how effectively they're executed may impact ski performance. Right. And so this, along with, other bigger picture concepts like, are their turns more Z-shaped or are they rounder and more progressive? Right. That could be a decent starting point depending on the goals of the group. Just as important as what they're doing with their skis and their bodies is when is that happening? Right. Does what you're observing happen at turn initiation? Does it happen through the belly of the turn or the shaping phase of the turn? Maybe through the finish or the transition of the turn. Maybe it's something that happens throughout the entire turn, right? Being descriptive with not just the what, but the when is important so that you can revisit that later. Just remember, observations are non-judgmental and objective, okay? You can't focus on everything at once, so try to focus on one thing at a time. Try to focus on cause and effect relationships between what the ski is doing and the body movement that's causing it. And define when it happens, what you're observing. When does it happen? Whether it's the turn phases or maybe they're asymmetric and have issues with their left versus their right turns. Right? I think the general format we should be looking for is the skis do X during turn phase Y because of body movement Z, okay? Like an example, like say the skis are stemmed at turn initiation because a long downhill leg blocks their lateral movement. Or maybe skis are tail heavy at turn initiation because lack of extension in the knees and hips doesn't move the center of mass across the skis. Right? Just a couple of places to start here. So with all of that in mind, on how we can categorize and describe our observations, I want to circle back to our narrowing our observation focus, right? We know that Audrey is thinking a lot about her medium radius turns, okay? And we know Rich has an imminent assessment coming up, but he's having some issues with leapers. is there anything that comes to mind knowing these student profiles and how you personally might narrow your observations? Right? Or at least just create a starting point in the vast sea of possibilities. Is there a particular set of fundamentals, skills, body movements, or whatever that comes to mind that you might focus on when observing these students, knowing these student profiles, right? Yeah, somebody said focus on flexion and extension, should assist with leapers and with turn shape. Fore and aft if the body is behind. Yep. Audrey should try to become less risk averse and learn to like the speed. Absolutely. She is, though, to give her credit. She's gotten so much better and has been done great at pushing her comfort zone. Audrey controlling edge angles through angulation and inclination. Rich regulating the magnitude of pressure. Yes. All good, great answers here. Ankle, knee, hip flexion. Yeah. There's a lot of great answers here, right? But we're going to start with Audrey here. She's making more carving-oriented medium turns, but take notes of the conditions here, okay? Spring slush with random moguls in the middle on a... with random moguls in the middle, right? And this is on a blue at Killington. Skylark, I think it is, if you're familiar. So both these videos, I have them playing in real time, and you'll get a chance to look at them in slow motion. What do we see the skis doing through different phases? What are the body movements that are contributing to what the skis are doing? Right? And remember, we're just kind of in observation mode right now. We're trying to make non-judgmental observations. Hopefully, maybe some of the concepts that you narrowed down to look for through our first section has kind of helped narrow your focus a bit. Just to kind of give you guys an example of what I'm going for here. I'll share one of my observations really quick just to give you an idea here. I noticed in Audrey that she has a very heavy tip pressure at turn finish because of a highly flexed ankle and a fairly extended knee and hip to the point where her femur is also vertical or almost vertical, right? So quick, objective, non-judgmental observation description. I'm sure you can all imply whether that's good or bad, but I'll save that. I'll save my evaluation for the next step. So Rich is making some higher performance short turns, right? It's hard to tell, but it looks like softish snow, though anyone who's ever done night skiing knows how deceiving that can be when it was soft during the day and then all of those ruts freeze in at night. But relative to the Killington blue Audrey was on, and that's important context in some cases, this looks like a gentler small mountain blue with less slush bump type terrain features going on here, a little bit smoother surface. I don't know what you all observed, and that's less important tonight than the theme of tonight of teaching group lessons. But I noticed something similar with Rich as I did with Audrey, okay? I again am seeing a very heavy outside ski tip pressure at turn finish. But in this case, it was actually causing the tail to wash out and create a bit of a downstem where the tail of the ski is getting pushed away from him at the very last second. Right, but I also saw that kind of same super flexed ankle that was present there as well, with a very kind of extended hip and knee right at the turn finish. So now that we have our observations in mind, now we can move on to evaluating those observations, right? How does what we observed line up with the goals of the students? And so this is where we get to unleash our favorite activity as ski instructors, right? Being a little judgmental, right? To a certain extent anyway, right? While saying something like, damn, your pole plants suck is an accurate judgment of my own skiing, right? We need to focus it down to something more productive for ourselves and our students. So once again, I want to start with the addition of that initial consider goals and desired outcome step, right? Because again, this should shape our evaluation. So we observed ski performance and body movements in that last step. Now we need to compare those to the goals of our students, okay? Right? Are the skis performing the best they could be to achieve the students' goals? Probably not. That's probably why they're here, right? But so then we need to evaluate why that is, though, right? We need to compare what their skis would ideally be doing and what their skis are currently doing. We need to look at what body movements they're currently making to cause their skis to perform the way they are, and then figure out what body movements need to change in order to allow the skis to perform closer to that ideal, right? Especially as it relates to their goals. What needs to change to help them work towards their goals? But there's a bigger picture that we also need to keep in mind here, right? We've got a group of people in front of us with their varying goals and needs that we need to deliver. We need to deliver value to all of them, right? So we need to circle back to those goals and how we categorize our observations. We need to find maybe some common threads or elements between our students to set us up for the next step after we finish evaluating our students. That next step, the actual prescription of activities and body movements to help create changes in our students. We got to set ourselves up for that. And so again, common threads could be a certain fundamental or skill. That's completely applicable and fine here, right? It could be a common body movement that has effects on different fundamentals or skills depending on the students or the particular spin I give it for each student's feedback. The common thread could even just be a collective desired end goal among your group, right? Maybe the whole group wants to work on moguls together. Maybe the whole group wants to carve better, right? And while the group may have the same goal, there could be varying reasons for why each of them has trouble achieving that goal. We can dig some of this up now while we're evaluating. So I'm going to put up both skiers at the same time now again and give everyone a chance to review their observations and now make an evaluation. All right, so we know Audrey, she wants to get better at her medium radius turns. All right, she wants to get a little bit more performance. Rich, he's going for his level 2, but's having some issues with leapers. Right, so based on your observations, how can we take what they're currently doing, right? And we want to evaluate what needs to change to go from what they're currently doing to help them get closer to their goals. But I'll share some of my evaluations relative to the observations I shared earlier, just to give you an idea, right? There is that common element of being too tip heavy at turn finish. While both were due to a really heavily flexed ankle, we saw a slight difference. We see a slight difference here in the actual outcome of what the skis are doing, right? So when thinking about what I observed in Audrey in relation to her goals, my evaluation might look something like this, right? Being so far forward at turn finish makes it hard for her to move laterally or forward into the next turn, right? It blocks some of her movement. So this forces her to extend both legs quickly to change edges and initiate the new turn, and limits her ski performance and options through the top half of the turn, right? So my evaluation is ultimately, I'd like to see her maintain that more flexed position she finishes her turn in through the turn transition and into a new turn to unlock more options, more progressive movements, and higher ski performance in the top half of the turn, right? I need to get her to open that ankle up a little bit more. Slide that ski forward a little bit more. But with Rich, right, we got that same heavy tip pressure, right? It manifests issues relative to his ski performance. It manifests his a little bit differently with him. So can see if you watch closely in the video, especially when he's coming at us, we can see it. We can see that his tails actually tend to wash out, leading to a down stem. Right? And so besides the fact that it's really hard to leap from a platform that has slid out from under you, that overly flexed ankle, right, where his foot and ski are like trailing way behind him, it also causes his hip and knee to be in a more extended position. Okay? And so if you pay attention to like the air between his legs there, particularly at turn finish, that gap begins to get like an almost A-frame-y triangle shape because the outside ankle is flexed significantly farther than the inside. And so considering two of the strongest muscles in our body, the glutes and the quads, are attached to those very extended knees and hips, right? That already extended position gives no room for Rich to extend farther from to generate the power to leap, right? Which is might be why he's having issues with leapers. So even though we have slightly different goals here, and the body movements we described are still kind of creating two different ski performance outcomes, we have a little bit of a common thread here, right? Thanks to our initial consideration, our observations, and now our evaluation. Right? I want to see both of their ankles open a little bit more and not get stuck in such a leveraged boot crushing position. Right? And with that, as the ankle opens up a little bit more, it'll allow their knees and hips to flex a bit more. Okay? And it's going to move their center of mass back more, but given their massively overpressured ski tips and underpressured ski tails, that's pretty okay with me. All right, so some observations here, or evaluations, I'm sorry. Right, so somebody said both have vertical body movements to initiate their turns and give up functional tension from their core. Result is dumping towards the end of their turns. I would agree with that. Right, for Audrey, I saw her shoulders turned before her skis at the initiation phase. I would agree with that observation. Audrey, make pull touches in direction of new turn and move the center of mass over skis. No distinct upper-lower body separation at turn initiation and hips fall. Yeah. Too aggressive with the ankle flexion. Yep. For Audrey, her center of mass is too forward on her skis. With Rich, I'm seeing a flattening of his skis and parallel skidding a bit with his turn versus applying edge pressure. Yeah. All right. So lots of great stuff here. But hopefully you've started to develop a student profile like this that we can now carry with us into the final step, okay? Like we have on the screen here, right? And so that brings us to prescription, right? Hopefully we've got an idea of what needs to change as far as body movements to change ski performance. So now we can begin prescribing those changes to our students, right? And the ultimate goal we started with was delivering a group lesson that caters to a diverse group of students with different goals and needs. But the challenge of this, once we get to the prescription step, is not getting caught up trying to teach 5 different lessons to 5 different people. Right? Besides the fact that if we have each student doing something different, it becomes a mind-numbingly terrible experience as a coach, right? But it's also isolating as a student since they're doing nothing. They're doing nothing in common with their peers. It also limits your opportunities to watch and deliver feedback, and in the worst case, it can sometimes scatter your group all over the place. We need to find activities that facilitate many needs, right? Activities that can cover the needs of everyone in your group. Activities that can be scaled in difficulty to challenge students that are crushing it, but scaled back to help students that might be struggling, right? And actually, those kinds of activities aren't these crazy unicorns that only exist in a fantasy land like you might expect. And just a suggestion, but don't be afraid to use assessment activities to coach a group with, right? We've got a whole library of activities right at our fingertips here. Even at something like my development team tryout, right? I use skate to shape to short turns during my teaching segments with a group of dev team candidates, right? And I can tell you, right now, if you ever want to develop a great relationship with your peers at a tryout or an assessment, you should just do hop to shorts at the very end of day 2 at a team trial when everybody is exhausted on the steepest slope at Waterville Valley. They'll love you, trust me. But while some folks relegate assessment activities to the category of stupid human tricks, right? They exist because they challenge a blend of fundamentals or skills, right? What separates level 2 and level 3 activities often comes down to how many fundamentals they challenge at the same time, right? With level 3 activities often challenging all of the fundamentals at the same time. Like even in activities like pivot slips, which many think of as a rotary focused drill, to me, that's an activity that actually emphasizes all of the skills that go into actually allowing the skis to freely pivot, right? Like I can't get a ski to pivot when I'm stuck in the back seat because my tails get locked up. I can't get a ski to pivot when I'm on a high edge angle because they need to flatten a bit more to reduce friction. I can't get a ski to pivot when I'm bracing against the downhill ski, right? And have a long downhill leg. I have to flex to bring that ski underneath me more. And so even though you may think of an activity as being biased one way or another, you can often give the group the same activity, but give each member of the group individual focuses and feedback within that activity. And so I'll give a more concrete example here in a moment, but we can also scale activities by modifying things like the terrain we're performing the activity on, right? I remember when I was a new hire, my first year teaching, they taught me using 1,000 steps as an activity to work with beginner students, right? But if you've ever attended a clinic, right, with the head or with the Eastern Region Examiner head coach Sue Kramer, she'll use that same exact 1,000 steps activity that I was told to use with beginners to break and coach a bunch of dev team candidates by doing it on steep black terrain. We can also modify things like the dirt, right? The duration, intensity, rate, or timing of movements. That could be something as simple as changing the radius of a turn in an activity, right? Usually new skills are easier to learn if we make the turn radius longer to slow everything down and give them more time to practice a movement, right? But what if you have some students still practicing while others are crushing it? Well, we can challenge those students who are doing better by say, keep practicing the same activity everybody's doing, but now try it in a short radius if you're feeling up to the challenge, right? To make it harder. While the other students who haven't mastered it yet can choose to keep working in like that longer radius, right? More at their own pace. And it doesn't just have to be the turn radius. It could be doing a certain movements faster or slower. Or maybe add or remove equipment. Right? Outside ski turns are used to challenge great skiers at level 3 assessments by taking away the inside ski as a crutch. But that's an activity that can also be scaled down to the beginner level just by modifying the dirt, right? Instead of taking away the inside ski for the entire turn, maybe it's just for part of the turn. Or maybe you could even reduce it farther to just a tap of the ski, maybe through all parts of the turn or just part of the turn. I obviously don't have time to create a comprehensive list of activities tonight and go over them, but Pete did a great job in his webinar of breaking down this process a little bit more, along with a larger overview of the lesson planning process, Tech Talk number 10, right? I suggest you check it out if you haven't seen it yet and want more info in this realm. But one of the cool tools that Pete provided in this webinar is his fundamentals and outcomes prioritization tool, right? And this is a tool that I've screenshotted here. It's also available on the OkemoTechTalks.com website underneath the description of his webinar. But basically, it allows you to create a list of activities that are categorized by the fundamental, the skill, or the desired outcomes of that activity, and allows you to build a toolbox you can bring with you into any situation, right? You can come into a lesson with this idea that, like, hey, right, Audrey has some fore and aft issues that's maybe also affecting her lateral movements, right? And then Rich also has some fore and aft issues, but it's affecting his ability to regulate ski and snow pressure. So what activities here do I have on my list that checks all of these boxes, right? And something like that for these students might be something that I like called stork turns, right? Because not only does that check off the fundamental boxes that I'm looking for, but it's an activity that can be done by both students, but I can give them different focuses, right? It's an activity that can be done slowly on moderate terrain or in a longer radius turn, but it can also be done at pitch or in a shorter radius if you want to make it more challenging, right? So if Audrey is being limited by fear, she can do it in a longer radius turn at slower speeds, while if Rich is crushing it, he can do it faster or in a shorter radius to keep him engaged and challenged. I'm going to wrap this up here pretty soon, gang, but I have some bad news to share. Once we make a prescription and we share it with our students, our job as instructors is not done there yet, okay? We must continue to keep their end goals in consideration. We must continue to make observations on the effects of our prescription. We must continue to evaluate if our observations are progressing students towards their goals, right? And then after all of that, we have to decide if we should continue with our prescription, maybe tweak our prescription or give some feedback to get them doing more of what we want if they're not doing it, or switch gears entirely. A couple years ago, just as an example, I ran an early season level 3 prep, and it was a rough start to winter with limited terrain, bad conditions, and not a lot of options, right? I happened to be using my handy dandy stork turns, but given the limited terrain, the challenging conditions, and the large concentration of people all trying to ski on that limited terrain blowing past our group, it was not only a little bit too challenging for parts of that group, but intimidating with members of the public blowing by, right? The correct course of action would have been to abandon ship and regroup, but not realizing this at first, I stuck to the course for a little bit too long. And the issue with that is that's the part where we start to begin to lose our students, right? Fear begins to hold them back, frustrations begin to build, we lose their trust, and a multitude of other bad effects, right? Ultimately, I did recognize this and I shifted gears, but looking back, I would have liked to recognize it earlier and make that change earlier. And so this process is very much a constant cycle that requires constant reevaluation of our path forward, right? Don't be afraid to make changes and admit defeat. I can promise you from an examiner perspective, if you come to an assessment and start down the wrong course, it's going to reflect much better upon you if you correct course. Even if you don't get to do everything you wanted to, right? It's still going to be way better than holding on tight and going down with your sinking ship, right? And this reflects back to our relevance gap example that we started with, right? Each one of those circles represented a decision point to adapt to the changing needs of our students. And those decisions can only be made by cycling through and repeating our steps, right? Consider the goals, observe the skis and body, evaluate if it's progressing them towards their goals, and keep on that prescription or make tweaks and allow us to keep adapting, right? And while I don't have time to run through multiple iterations of the cycle tonight, I figured we'd cap off tonight's core discussion with my final prescription of these students. Considering everything we've discussed so far about these two, one place I might start of many possible avenues is this fabled stork turn, right? And stork turns, as this video from the New Zealand Snow Sports Instructor Alliance illustrates, is just where the tail of the inside ski is lifted off the ground, for those that don't know what it is, right? It challenges you with fore and aft movement because you have to maintain the tip contact with the snow. It challenges your lateral balance and edging movements because you can't end up too far inside, otherwise you'll lose your balance and drop the tail of that inside ski. But a tweak I actually like to make to this activity sometimes to help give some students a different focus is paying attention to how that tail is picked up. And while I don't want to get into extreme details for the sake of time, I can explain it more later if somebody really wants to know. But I make the focus of lifting the tail of the inside ski, not by picking it up and moving it closer to the body, but by flexing and extending the outside leg while keeping the inside leg the same length, right? And so this creates more of an emphasis on that last fundamental involving ski and snow pressure that we mentioned Rich might have been having some issues with, right? It takes this common thread of a body movement, the flexion and extension of leg joints that we talked about earlier, and forces the skier to make more appropriate movements in multiple fundamentals. And so I absolutely want to hear everyone share their prescriptions here shortly and answer any questions, but I want to wrap things up for anyone who needs to take off. Just remember, with groups, always start considering your students' goals, okay? We can use those to take the dizzying amount of potential observations and focus them down, direct our evaluations, and influence our prescriptions. But as we give our prescriptions, our job isn't done there, right? Continue to reflect upon those goals as you repeat the cycle, helping steer you as you make modifications to the lesson plan to help direct our students towards their goals, right? I ask everyone not to fear these challenging environments, but to learn or to lean into the opportunities these challenges provide us as an instructor, right? And definitely don't be afraid to throw your plan out the window, shoot from the hip, and make it up as you go if it means you're more conscious and considerate of the students in front of you. So for anyone who needs to take off or is tired of my rambling, I want to thank you for joining us on Okemo Tech Talks tonight. You give myself, as well as our wonderful guest speakers, this platform and opportunity, and I'm forever grateful for your involvement in helping turn this tech talk into what it is. And I also want to thank our brave movement analysis subjects tonight, Audrey and Rich. It takes a lot to put yourself out there like that. And I will say, if anyone wants to volunteer their footage for the greater educational cause, please reach out. I'm trying to build a library of videos for educational use. For those who want to stick around, I'm going to put our skiers back up for further discussion. I would love to hear what you've come up with as far as observation and prescriptions. And I'm certainly happy to provide feedback or allow others to chime in with their ideas. If you have any questions related to tonight's discussion, I'm here for you. But with that, the floor is yours, my friends. By the way, I've been standing this whole presentation just to make sure I don't talk too long.